Okay, thank you for anyone who came to watch this lecture. So this lecture will be on artificial intelligence and the human mind. First, I just want to introduce myself. My name is Raya. I'm from Slovenia. I was a debater in Slovenia for a few years. Right now, I live and study in the Netherlands. I study at Maastricht University and I study psychology and neuroscience. And that's also kind of why I wanted to do this lecture, because that is a topic we do to a largest extent at my faculty. Artificial intelligence is a really big and important topic. And I think the connection between the human mind and psychology and artificial intelligence is just something that's overlooked. It's something that I'm very passionate about. And it's something I just wanted to share with other people who like to learn and like to find out about new things. I just wanted to say that I'm still a student. Perhaps I might get something wrong. I'm not the biggest expert on the field. I'm still young. If you have any corrections or if you just have any points of feedback, if you have any points of discussion, anything you just want to talk about on the topic, I'd be more than happy to talk to you. Feel free to send me an email or contact me in any way. I'm always open for discussion. Okay, so first of all, let's do an outline of what I'll be talking about. So the general questions I'll be addressing is what even is artificial intelligence, how it is connected to the human brain, and what will the future of it look like? So in terms of material, I'll go briefly through the history of AI. I'll make a connection to the human mind afterwards. We'll do a small drill. We'll talk about how to apply this to a debating context. Towards the end, we'll look into the future of AI, how to debate about the future of AI, and then also just what are some general advantages and disadvantages of AI that you can as well use in debates. All right, so first of all, let's look at what even is AI and what are important examples of it in history. Now, first of all, there are many aspects and many approaches when it comes to AI. One important field that I'll be focusing on is machine learning. Machine learning is a huge branch within AI, and quite literally, it means looking into how machines are able to learn by themselves without human interventions. So in concrete terms, this means we give an AI program a certain issue, a certain problem, a certain game it needs to play, and then that machine should be able to by themselves find a strategy using creativity and then learn by itself. So a definition of human AI, it's usually quite complicated and there are several different definitions, but something to keep in mind is just that AI is made to imitate human intelligence as well as possible, essentially being able to imitate human learning, human memory, and just the way we're able to reason so well as a species. Now, a really important test that has been used throughout history to test AI has been the Turing test. It's named after this incredible man, Alan Turing. You might know him. He was a very important figure in the Second World War. He basically cracked the enigma. Maybe you've seen the movie Imitation Game. I really recommend that movie. But the Turing test is a test in which a participant has a certain blockade in front of them, has a certain door, and behind that blockade, there is either a machine or a human being. And then they talk to the person or the entity on the other side. And then if the machine is able to come across as a human to the participant, that means the machine has passed the Turing test. Now that test is slightly dated now. We have a lot more sophisticated technology to test AI, but it is just something which serves as a starting point to test AI in the first place. Another important thing I want to point out is that empathy is becoming a prominent component when it comes to defining AI. Now, IQ, intelligence in a classical sense, is still important, but another important aspect is also emotional intelligence. And if we want to use AI more in the common life, and if we want to implement it more and more, that also means we have to work on developing the emotional aspect of robots as well. So what are some important examples from history? I think it's just important to give you some context where we've been decades ago and where we are now, and what are just some examples that you maybe should know about. Now, you should know that these examples are mainly from the field of human care, from the field of psychology, medicine, and other related fields. So of course, there are other aspects and approaches. This is something that I'm more specialized in. So firstly, we have the ELIZA program in 1966. Now, this was an incredible breakthrough because ELIZA was able to imitate human conversation. You would basically type in a question into ELIZA and it will be able to verbally respond to you. And it was used in psychology in the beginning. Now, in the 1980s, the Perry program was developed. Perry was incredibly important because it was recognized to be one of the first machines to be able to pass the Turing test. Perry was a program which imitated a patient with paranoid schizophrenia, so with the symptoms of it. And essentially, we had a participant talking to Perry, and they did not know whether they're talking to a real person with schizophrenia or whether they're talking to a machine. So it was a huge breakthrough when it comes to understanding symptoms of different disorders. Lastly, a really just, I think, interesting program to know is the Watson program. Watson was developed first to play the game Jeopardy, on a TV show, Jeopardy, as you know, and it actually ended up winning Jeopardy, so beating human champions of Jeopardy and winning the prize. I think it was $1 million. Now, that was just the beginning of Watson. Afterwards, it started to be used in hospitals, so largely in medicine, and now it's being used by nurses all over the world because it's able to process large amounts of data and therefore diagnose patients with cancer in a matter of minutes because it can just recognize symptoms so quickly. So those are just a few examples of extraordinary AI that is already being used in important fields to help the quality of life of people. On the right side here, you can see a picture of the Enigma developed by Alan Turing and his team. And it's just, I think it's interesting to see how far machines have come since then, because this basically looks like a box. Right now, we have far more sophisticated technology. Okay, human-minded AI. So this will perhaps be the most abstract part of this lecture, but I think it's a really important connection just to be recognized. And that's something that's just not talked about when it comes to strictly AI. So something that I want to point out is this idea of deep learning. And when it comes to artificial intelligence, as I've mentioned, one of the biggest problems is how to make machines be able to learn by themselves. And one of the ways we've surpassed that as scientists in the last few decades is by using artificial neural networks. So you should know that in the beginning, when AI was beginning to be developed, we expected it's going to be way quicker in terms of development than it actually was. There was a certain blockade which we reached. There was a hindrance when it comes to machines just not being able to learn as quickly as humans do. So how do we do this? One of the reasons why we were able to surpass that is because we use artificial neural networks, which are essentially just networks imitating the human brain, right? So in our human brain, we have neurons connected by synapses. We have millions of neurons, which create networks together. And those networks are able to learn based on the synapses and the strengths of connections between neurons. Now, that is besides the point right now, but what I want to convey is that when we are able to create just some symbol of network for the human brain, and we take that as a basis for AI, that really helps us with programming AI because it is quite similar in terms of the structure of its working. So once we were able to understand how neural connections work in the brain, and we took that as a model for machines as well, that has greatly helped us in terms of making machines learn by themselves. So yeah, it's a critical thing for developing AI, and it has been in the past, and it's still a continuing field. Another thing that I want to mention here is just this idea of cognitive science as a field. Maybe you hear cognitive science being mentioned more and more. It's a rising field that not a lot of people just know what exactly it is. But what's incredibly interesting is that essentially cognitive science uses brain, the neural connections, just any functioning of the brain, and uses that as basis for AI, uses that for basis for computers. And it also goes the other way around. The more we understand how computers work and how machines work, the better we're also able to understand our brain, which is kind of crazy because our brain invented computers and AI. But once we understand how coding works, how networks in machines work, we can use that as basis for our brain as well. Here underneath, you can just see an example of like how the analogy works between brain and mind. And I just wanted to give you also an example of a machine which was able to achieve deep learning or machine learning, and that is AlphaGo. AlphaGo is a machine which plays the game called Go. It's kind of similar to chess. It also beat the world champion of Go. And what's crazy about AlphaGo is that the scientists behind AlphaGo just taught AlphaGo the rules of the game and the first few steps of it. No advanced strategy, no way to beat the world champion. And AlphaGo by itself was able to find a strategy to beat world champion. It exhibited incredible ways of machine learning. Okay, so after this abstract part, I think it's fair that you can take a break if you want. So be comfortable to pause right now for a few minutes and take a little water break. And whenever you're ready, just feel free to continue. All right, so welcome back if you took a break. Now this part will focus more on debating AI. So if the part before was a little bit abstract to you and you weren't maybe that interested in it, right now we'll make things a bit more concrete and look into how to use all the knowledge you're getting about AI in debate context. All right, so we're gonna do a drill. So here you can see a motion, which is this house believes that AI will bring more harm than good. This motion, I think, appears quite often just in different forms. Sometimes you may see a form of this house will ban further development of AI, this house would tax companies developing AI. Essentially, you're just comparing the benefits and the harms of AI. And a lot of us just don't know realistically what AI is about and what it will look like in the future. So the point of this drill is to examine what do you know already about AI and robots, and then compare it to the knowledge that I will give you in the next few slides. So after these instructions, I would like you to pause the presentations for up to 5 minutes and to come up with the following ideas. So first of all, I want you to find answers to the following questions, just based on your general knowledge. So what do you think is the prediction of the future of AI? What do you think it's going to look like in 20 to 50 years? Do you think that most predictions for the futures are accurate? So the things you see from movies, the things you read in news, do you think that that is mostly accurate, or it's exaggerating, or it's maybe under exaggerating? And lastly, think about the way AI is portrayed in movies and the way the future of AI is portrayed in movies, and think whether that is mostly accurate or whether it's sensationalized or if it's just done in a completely wrong way. These prompts are important because I think if you're able to answer these questions for yourself, I think this also helps you with thinking of mechanisms in debates as well. So reasons for why we see AI as it is. And then another thing I want you to just think of is the examples of AI you know. So I've given you some historic examples, but try to think of the everyday technology we use or you may use as a student or your parents may use or your friends. Think of examples and think of whether those examples are largely beneficial or whether there's something that could potentially be very dangerous in a few decades. So yeah, pause and then come back. All right, so hopefully you've come up with a few of the ideas suggested on the previous slide. So the thing is, the way this drill works is the next two slides will offer you literature-based explanations to those ideas. So we will compare the knowledge you've probably gathered from media, from reading books, from your education, and we'll compare that to what the experts say on the topic when it comes to the future and the examples of AI. After you have listened to the whole of this lecture, I would like you to think of one argument against the motion and one argument for the motion. The motion is the same as on the previous slide. It's this house believes that AI will bring more harm than good. Please send your arguments to the following link. I believe that this same link is used for all different coaches and for all different lectures. So take a picture of it now, but even if you miss the link now, send the arguments to me like if you get this link from any other source. All right, so now let's look at what the experts say when it comes to the future of AI. So a lot of the times it is thought that AI will simply take over humans in 50 years. And I just want to point out that there's no certain way of knowing what will happen in the future, but we can look at certain trends which are mostly correct and certain trends which are mostly false. So take this information with a grain of salt. Nothing is certain when it comes to predicting the future, but we can have certain scientific predictions. Moore's law states that the speed and capacity of computers doubles every 2 years, or it has in the past 30 years. And the prediction is that by 2045, AI will advance to the point of the singularity, so of unified intelligence. So essentially, oftentimes certain experts believe that there is exponential growth of AI and it will keep developing and developing until it is essentially at the point of super intelligence, of something that we might see in movies or in disaster scenarios. Now, oftentimes that is an exaggeration, and this slide will offer you systemic reasons to use in debates to prove why most predictions regarding AI are wrong. So essentially, if you are in a debate and if the other side is claiming we should not have AI because it will develop to the point where it will destroy humans or destroy Earth, these are the reasons and these are the mechanisms you can use to prove and say, hey, actually, most predictions are false. The situation is not as black as you paint it to be. The situation is realistically looking much more positive and less dreadful. So here are a few reasons. So first we have the My Guru law. And this law essentially states that most experts predicting development of AI believe that AI will develop during their lifespan. So no matter at what age this expert is, whether that expert is 25 or whether that expert is 65, most of them believe that AI will develop until the end of their lifespan. Now, that is largely due to human bias, and honestly, just a lot of experts subconsciously hope that they will witness the development of AI and the rise of it. So that is one thing to keep in mind. Another thing is that most experts predict AI to greatly develop 15 to 20 years in the future. So in the 90s, the prediction was that in 2010s, AI will greatly develop. Now the prediction is that in 2040s, AI will greatly develop. So you can see that that is keep being pushed further and further into the future. An interesting graph, I put it here on the right. It is a little bit blurry, but the important thing you need to see here is the dots. And this is a graph comparing when the experts versus non-experts will predict that AI will greatly develop. And you can basically see that the dots for experts and non-experts overlap. There is a similar trend for both of them, and that trend is largely random. There is no clear line. There is no like one group of dots on that graph. And what this tells us is that essentially experts don't come up with conclusive predictions when it comes to the future. The opinions for when AI will develop and to what extent are completely different when it comes to experts all over the world of different ages, of different institutions. So we cannot really reliably trust any predictions of AI. Another thing, a mechanism you can talk about is when it comes to technology in general, there is this concept of Amara's law, which is oftentimes present. Amara's law states that we oftentimes overestimate the effect of technology in the short term, but we underestimate the effect of it on the long term. For example, when it comes to GPS, in the beginning, it was predicted to have this huge effect on human life, that it will greatly change the way we live, that it will perhaps doom us, that it will completely change navigation and war and the way military operates. So it was overestimated. Now, on the long term, we actually use it every day in our phones, every day in our cars, but we actually underestimate how much it helps us. We don't care about it as much. We don't even consider or appreciate how much GPS helps us in daily lives. So Amara's law again states that on the long term, we underestimate it, but on the short term, we see it as this big, horrible thing. Another point is that we assume that there will be exponential progress of AI, but the thing is, we don't know yet which barriers we will face when we keep on developing AI. An example of that would be decades ago, we thought that the progress would be exponential. Then we run into a problem of machine learning. Machines are not able to learn by themselves as quickly as we thought, and then the whole progress is hindered. So exponential progress is something we expect, but it's just something that realistically does not happen with the development of technology. And the last thing when it comes to prediction is Hollywood scenarios. I think media largely impacts the way we see things and also predict things. For example, we think that AI will come sooner in the future, but also in a much more negative form than it actually does. We see all these movies about doomsday scenarios, about robots taking over the earth, about robots being hostile. So we also expect that when developing AI. But realistically, there is no good prediction and no reliable prediction to know that AI will turn on us or will even just have negative effects on us that is solely coming from human prediction, oftentimes based on media. All right, so now something which is very useful for debates is to have fancy examples. And here are a few examples, so you don't have to do the research yourself. I'm joking, of course, you should do the research, but these are just some easy examples you can use to sound cooler. All right, so the first one is Sim Coach. Yeah, I just want to point out that these are all examples, again, from the field of human care, so medicine, psychology, and all related fields. Again, there's so many other uses of AI, but this is a good example of a field where it actively helps improve quality of life and the length of life and the experiences we have. So that's why it's such an important field of AI. So the first one is Sim Coach. Sim Coach is a program already widely used by veterans, especially in the United States. It's a program in which veterans are able to log in their symptoms and basically talk to an expert, that expert being an AI. And it is really, really beneficial to veterans because, firstly, that way there's no stigma for them because oftentimes they're afraid to talk about mental health due to stigma in the army. Well, and secondly, Sim Coach is available day and night at any point, and it's able to process large amounts of data. So it's very quick and very beneficial to veterans that have access to it. RP Vida is just another program which is able to process someone's symptoms and give um, their call and give their diagnosis in a matter of minutes. It's also FDA approved, and it's something which is used in medicine basically more and more. It's here on the right side. That would be example of Vida. And the last one is clinical virtual reality. This one is mostly like personally satisfying to me and just mostly like very interesting. So because virtual reality is something we know most from video games, but it's actually used also for very beneficial health related purposes. So the way this works, just as an example, is that you sit down with VR glasses on a couch, and then virtually you see a therapist. And that therapist can either be AI program or it can be also a real person. That actually doesn't matter. But why it's so important is because we can program the environment in which you get your therapy, and also we can program what that therapist looks like. What's interesting is kids oftentimes use it, and we program therapists to be animals or to wear a certain costume or to just have certain appearances, certain looks which are appealing to children and make the situation more friendly. We can put someone to have therapy in nature or in a boat in the sea. So it can basically create a very safe space and a really fun environment to have therapy in. And it can help in all sorts of situations with different kinds of trauma. Now, in debates, oftentimes you will get called out for not having unique impacts, not making something mutually exclusive. And here are just a few reasons why AI is so uniquely beneficial for humans, and it offers something which humans oftentimes cannot do. So yeah, these are unique benefits you can use in debates. The first one would be speed and quantity of data processing. This is especially important when it comes to saving human lives, or just when it comes to therapy. If you have a patient coming in with symptoms, we need to know how to diagnose them as soon as possible. We cannot wait forever. And we all know that the healthcare system is already preoccupied. That is why AI is so beneficial in the healthcare system, especially. Another unique quality is reduced human bias. Now, it is true that humans programming AI might transfer their own biases into AI, but that will still be decreased exactly because AI is not usually programmed by one person, it's usually programmed by a large group of scientists, which is then checked by different committees of ethics or different boards. It's never just one person. It is possible to have bias, but it is likely to be smaller than in humans. There will also be a reduced amount of cognitive errors. So humans, when we think, we oftentimes just make errors. Probably we all know that. That is something which just does not happen with AI. Errors are incredibly rare. It's not very likely that AI will make a certain error. And lastly, humans, we just get tired and that causes us to make mistakes. There's no issue with fatigue when it comes to AI. The last thing is sensory technology. So AI is able to detect, for example, your temperature, your eye movement changes, your small mimics, small movements on your face, on your arms. And then it is able to also diagnose you in medicine, but also when it comes to therapy, it is able to just see how you behave and based on that help you out. Those are such small changes which humans oftentimes cannot detect. All right, the very last thing I want to talk about is also the problems of AI. And the reason why I here say realistic is oftentimes when you talk about negative aspects of AI, we talk about just very unrealistic Hollywood-based reasons, and few which is oftentimes irrational. So these are the actual realistic reasons you can use in a debate instead of just saying maybe it will take over in 50 years. The first reason is the difference between performance versus competence. So what I mean by that is if you ask AI, what is a frisbee? It will be able to give you all information there is about frisbees, how they're used, like what color, their technicalities. But as soon as you ask it a slightly more competent question, such as, or a complicated question, such as, can a person eat a frisbee? It will not be able to answer that in the majority of cases because that is like a random question they can just not compute. It's not something they were taught. So humans can still generalize concepts, can generalize things. AI, in majority of cases, cannot. Another reason is ethical judgments. I think this one is maybe one of the more famous ones. So we maybe people listening to this, maybe you know autonomous cars. I think that's a big topic in general. So can an autonomous car make an ethical judgment when crashing? Who does it run into? It is oftentimes compared also to the trolley problem. So would it rather run into an elderly person or a child, you know, scenarios like that. So it doesn't really have a programming set up for making ethical judgments, and we don't know really how to do that because humans struggle with ethics as well. So that's a big question mark when it comes to developing AI. Another thing is question of responsibility. So can we put responsibility on AI if it makes a mistake? Who is responsible? It is still unclear. Also legally, there is oftentimes not yet legislation to cover that. Another popular one is job loss. So job loss does not only concern automation, so very simple machines, but it also concerns AI, so more complicated, more sophisticated machines. It is very possible that in the future, perhaps machines will take jobs of doctors, of therapists. In debates, oftentimes you hear arguments, machines will never be able to take human jobs which require human contact and warmth and that personal touch. It is actually possible the machines will be able to do that. I think this lecture really gave you a few examples of how AI is already being so beneficial in the field of medicine and psychology, but that is a double-edged sword. It can also create job loss, maybe in the future. But yeah, again, we just don't know what the future will look like. And the last thing is the skill of judgment. Humans are just better at making quick judgments based on several factors. A simple judgment would be deciding where to go study to university or deciding with which friend to meet to go get ice cream. Those kinds of judgments where you take several random factors into account and then you take your own mood into account. And then just being able to make a quick judgment, that's something that AI is not able to do yet. So far in status quo, we are able to manage AI, but the AI itself cannot be the manager yet. I think that's the simplest explanation for it. Okay, These are a few book recommendations and a few movie and series recommendations. Just take a little picture if you want to, a little photo. Otherwise, I'll just move on. All right, so this will be the end of my lecture. I want to finish with this quote, which I think is kind of funny, maybe kind of sad. I visualize a time when we will be to robots what dogs are to humans, and I'm rooting for the machines. It is a bit satirical, but what I think it conveys importantly is that we oftentimes project human nature onto machines and onto AI. We often think that AI will be hostile or will turn against humans because that is something which humans do, but that may not be something that AI does. So whenever you think about AI, whenever you think about the future, make sure to not project human qualities on it, because the future might be a lot more positive than we think, as long as we don't try to make them completely similar to humans. Okay, thank you so much for attending this lecture. Feel free to ask me any questions via my email or any other channel you have to contact me. I hope you enjoyed it and I hope you learned something. And thank you very much for attending it.